Hey folks, welcome to Step Back. Today we're digging deep into American history to learn the origins of... Who's interrupting me in the middle of shooting? It's an email from a Dinesh D'Souza. Weird. Dear purveyor of maximum cuckoldry, I heard you were making a video on the history of US political parties. Well, I did some research back in 2016 and published this documentary. You need to see it. Isn't that convenient? Let's pause and give this baby a watch.
What if the goal of the Democratic Party is to steal the most valuable thing the world has ever produced? What if their plan is to steal America?
I am a man from Africa.
You can hide a lot of theft if it's concealed under the guise of charity. We learned that from the musical Evita.
Holy crap. That was garbage. He ignored half of American history and then got the other half wrong. Well, it's good to know I don't need to change anything about my video. No one could possibly take him seriously. Now, time to stop monologuing and film the video. However, that Margaret Thatcher video I did as a response to PragerU was my most successful video in years. What if I... No, right? I'm a serious documentarian, not some cheap entertainer in the WWE of performative media politics.
If you have a hollow identity, how do you create nationalism?
You are unworthy of my gifts. The ping pong table. The pill that makes you never have to poop again.
You have knocked out half the villagers in the town and you've destroyed the bar. Oh. Right. But it's Dinesh D'Souza. Nobody takes this guy seriously. Oh God, what is it this time?
Tragedy at the poorly animated Democratic Party Museum today. A man armed with a massive novelty glove has broken in and interrogated staff in a belligerent manner. Here is a police sketch produced with the help of museum staff. Among the questions demanded of the staff, he asked for the location of some sort of time gem. If you know the location of this man or this universe-bending artifact, please report it to the FBI at the tip line below. The FBI believes the suspect to be 59-year-old author, filmmaker, and convicted campaign finance criminal Dinesh D'Souza. Wait, how could you be dumb enough to commit campaign finance fraud in America? It's virtually decriminalized at this point.
Holy shit. Think of the SEO. Maybe if I retool this video as a response, to own him, then it'll get lots of views. I mean, as a teaching method, of course. Maybe if he sees the errors of his way, he'll stop a rampage of death and destruction.
Tonight, exclusively here on Fox News, we have a documentarian, and should I say, American hero, Dinesh D'Souza.
Thank you, Michaela.
Now, I think we know why you're here. The liberal media has raked you over the coals today because of what anyone could see is just an expression of your First and Second Amendment rights.
I agree entirely, Michaela. This isn't about who destroyed whose party headquarters. I was just there to ask some questions.
Understandable. We have audio of that right now, actually.
Where is the time gem?
I don't know what you...
Here I wield the power of God. If you do not tell me the location of the time gem, I will destroy you and this building.
I don't know anything. I'm sorry.
So, did you enter the Democratic Museum armed with an ancient artifact of godly power?
Listen, Michaela, I'd be lying if I said I didn't enter the museum with the Infinity Gauntlet, the power to create and destroy the universe. But if you think about it, that's just my right to have a weapon to defend myself. I'm just a man on a search for the last powerful gem to give me the ability to rewrite reality as I see fit. If this is the America I know, I should have the right to my own pursuit of happiness.
Thank you, Dinesh. Up next, Speaker Pelosi proposed tax cuts on dividends for those making over $2 million a year. Is this the path to socialism? And how exactly will this ruin this country and force you into a re-education camp?
Okay, I think I know what to do. A scathing video review. The guy is a sitting duck, a fish in a barrel, another metaphor for something easy. Fuck it, let's record.
Where is it?
I mean, Mrs. Clinton always kept a glowing green gem in the headquarters, but she said it was for decoration. Please don't hurt me!
Excellent. You've been so helpful. Don't worry, this will be painless. Oops, wrong setting.
In this video, I respond to a 2016 documentary by Dinesh D'Souza, released right before the election, called Hillary's America. It feels pretty dated for something only one presidential election old. For example, Republicans still pretend they thought racism was bad. The documentary features D'Souza while doing time for campaign finance fraud. Yes, that's real. Learning the secret history of the Democratic Party. In scenes like this, where he sneaks into the Democratic Museum, he explains that Democrats are hiding a secret. They are actually the party of white supremacy and slavery and have been for a long time. D'Souza assumes the audience will think the Democrats' racist past is a surprise. It's unfortunate to think that the US is so historically illiterate, it's somehow a shock to the system to find this out. The Soviet Union were US allies during World War II, and basically won the war. Is that a shock too? But parties are organizations. They're not a singular group, but made up of different constituencies. America, with only two political parties, didn't divide on clear ideological grounds so much as on different regions and identities banding together. Why don't I call in someone who can explain this better than I can?
How do you get from the Democratic Party of the Civil War and the Redeemer governments after the Civil War to the party of Barack Obama? And how do you get from the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln to the Republican Party of Donald Trump and Dinesh D'Souza? The two parties in America largely is a two-party system, and that's part of why this conversation happens. What the two parties are is not nailed down ideologically, right? Like they really weren't ever organized on ideological grounds. Americans didn't even really use the left-right spectrum until the mid-20th century. To talk about one party being on the left and one party on the right would have made no sense to 19th century Americans. Instead, the parties were kind of crazy patchwork quilts of ethnic, sectional, racial, religious loyalties tied in with kind of specific interest groups. Different industries supported one party or the other. So, in the 19th century, the Republican Party was the party of northern industrialists, backed it largely. That's where the money came from. And the Democratic Party was the party of southern agrarian wealth. That's where their money came from. But even that is too simple. Every American election is an attempt to stitch together a constituency that'll get you just over the hump, just to that 50.001% of votes. And so it makes all kinds of strange bedfellows. To sort of ask, what is the ideological core of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, just doesn't make any historical sense. And then you take that and you take the fact that they're always sort of competing and circling and trying to break off support from the other party. What you actually have is two blobs of jelly that are in motion, that are circling one another. So Abraham Lincoln had this great quote back, in Lincoln's day, in 1850, somebody made the same sort of comment. They said, isn't it funny that the party of Adams and the party of Jefferson have kind of switched places in this modern day of 1855? And Lincoln said it reminded him of a story of two drunks wrestling in a bar. And he said, he watched these two drunks wrestling and fighting, and they were too drunk to really, for either one to ever get a good punch off, but they rolled and rolled and rolled around the floor of the bar room. And then when they got up, somehow they had each put on the other guy's coat. They had wrestled the other guy out of his coat and each put on the other guy's coat and walked home none the wiser. And Lincoln said, The two parties are kind of like that. And that's, in a way, it's much too simple to say the two parties have switched places, but what they are is not nailed down. So the discovery that either party supported something in the 1870s or even the 1960s that it doesn't support today, it's an interesting historical fact, but it's not really a conspiracy or a huge revelation.
The Republicans, who Dinesh praises as moral paragons, changed a lot after the Civil War, too. They attempted to rebuild the South as a multiracial democracy. In this Reconstruction period, African Americans who were slaves less than a decade ago became politicians, at least in the places where the federal government and the U.S. Army had significant control. You saw Republican victories in the South, like PBS Pinchback, Louisiana's first black governor. In 1872, there wouldn't be another African-American governor until Virginia elected Douglas Wilder in 1990. The South after the war was brutal. Terrorist insurgent groups like the Ku Klux Klan suppressed African-Americans and Northern Republicans. Through murder. There are so many moments of horror during this time, I can't possibly get into it now, but I did make a video years ago on one incident, the Colfax Massacre, if you're curious or weirdly into hate crimes or whatever. This period between early and modern American history is often where US history classes break for the semester. Because of that, it gets woefully overlooked.
Was President Lincoln okay?
He was fine.
While Southern Republicans were primarily African Americans and pro-civil rights, Northern Republicans were more interested in industrialization, making money, and working with a corrupt federal government to build railroads. Republicans and Northerners in general were sick of the national attention on the South, and so the political will to keep Reconstruction going on the Republicans' terms waned. The turning point was one of the most important elections in American history you probably haven't heard of, the election of 1877.
Ulysses S. Grant, the Republican president, former Civil War hero, Ulysses Grant is stepping down. He's done his 2 terms. Rutherford Hayes is the Republican. Samuel Tilden is the Democrat. They're both Northern governors. And the election is basically a tie. And it's so close, too close to call. And it hinges on the disputed electors from a couple of southern states where, because of violence of Reconstruction and everything, there are real questions about the legitimacy of the votes from those southern states. So how are you going to decide who gets those electoral votes? And it's close enough that how you decide is going to decide who the next president is. They decide it the way everything in the 19th century gets decided. A bunch of wealthy men hide in the smoky back room of a hotel and smoke cigars and do some horse trading. What comes out of the back room is the Compromise of 1877. And we'll never know exactly the terms of the deal. They didn't print it out on a contract or anything, but it appears that the deal was that the Democrats would consent to the election of Rutherford Hayes, the Republican, that he would get the White House, and in return, the federal government would remove all troops from the South and let the South run its own affairs. As a kind of a fig leaf to the Republican sensibilities, the white Southerners said, don't worry, we promise to respect the rights of the freedmen and freedwomen. But everybody knew what it meant to take the troops home and to leave the freedmen and women to the tender mercies of the white South. And the Republicans took the deal, or maybe they offered the deal. I don't know, I wasn't in the room, but the compromise was struck. Rutherford B. Hayes became the president. The Republicans had the White House. The troops came home and Reconstruction was over. That was the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of the rebuilding, a new form of white supremacy, the building of the Jim Crow South. And the deal that was struck really in a larger sense was that, the Republican Party, they were still going to pride themselves on being the party of Lincoln, and they were still going to say, remember who saved the Union, but they weren't going to get up in the South's grill about how they treated black people anymore.
Also, the end of Reconstruction and the building of infrastructure paved the way for a new important American project. There was a whole West out there, and they wanted white people to settle it. It was time to expand, but wouldn't you know, there was a minor complication. The area was already occupied by tons of indigenous nations. So, the Republican-led government, which Dinesh claims is super not racist, did a racist genocidal series of wars of aggression to force indigenous people off of their territory so white people could move there. And this wasn't an isolated incident. We don't even have time today to go into the Spanish-American War and the late 19th and early 20th century flirtation with old-school colonization of the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. So yeah, the Republicans aren't the moral paragons D'Souza says they are, but we can't let the Democrats off the hook either. It's almost like painting one party or the other as good or bad is useless. Moving into the 20th century, the documentary attacks the progressive movement. Again, D'Souza blames everything bad that he didn't just skip over on the Democratic Party, which again he portrays as a singular entity with a will of its own and not a massive conglomerate of often disagreeing positions. The early 20th century was a period of grotesque inequality, known as the Gilded Age.
That label, the Gilded Age, the term, it comes from a novel by Mark Twain, but something that's gilded means it looks golden on the outside, but it's actually corrupt or chintzy and on the inside. But the term refers to the corruption of American politics. It refers to the vast inequalities in the American economy in the late 19th century. And I think it's a pretty good term for the era and a pretty good term for our era, too.
Instead of talking about that rot at the center of society, Dinesh focuses on the progressive movement, trying to draw connections to the modern progressive movement. Today's progressive movement has more to do with distinguishing people who want the Democrats to move away from neoliberalism, but I am literally a century ahead of myself right now. Why try to make the connection between the progressives of today and those of 100 years ago? Well, Dinesh spends a good amount of runtime linking various early 20th century progressive movements into one democratically backed amalgamation. Then he spins a conspiracy that the abortion and birth control movements are an evil democratic plot to commit covert genocide on African American people. He also says Democrats tricked African Americans into voting for them. So to follow his logic, they're killing their own voter base and also members of the Democratic Party. Part of me is starting to think perhaps Dinesh didn't think this through. To sell this narrative, D'Souza brings up the progressive movement's real dark side. He doesn't talk about the 8-hour workday, the women's vote, the beginning of social work, or all the advances made in this period, but eugenics. And yeah, major progressive figures such as Margaret Sanger had some pretty yikes ideas about eugenics and sterilization. It was actually quite in vogue until, the Nazis used the ideology of eugenics to advance the darkest chapter of human history. Well, there goes my monetization. Bye. Patreon! This stance against eugenics is a perfect example of the time capsule effect of Hillary's America. In 2016, it was just taken for granted racist eugenics programs should make the Trump supporters react with revulsion. It would still be abhorrent to many an American conservative, but not enough. I really wish we had the 1930s Republican Party, who made a distinction between being conservative and being fond of Nazis. Anyway, what Dinesh does in this movie is to reduce historical figures to good guys and bad guys. If you watch Step Back, you'll know that's not what we do here. Speculating on how they feel or separating them from the context of their time is pointless. People aren't fictional characters. They're contradictory, complicated, and understanding them on the terms of their eras is literally a full-time job. That's called being a historian. But adding on to this discussion of progressives, there were also progressive Republicans. Parties were less ideologically driven back then, and up until about the Reagan administration, there were liberal Republicans. One of the big progressive presidents was Republican Teddy Roosevelt. In 1912, he was so angry with the party's conservative choices, he ran for president as a third-party candidate, that third party being called the Progressive Party. And that was a significant moment in Republican history. From then on, they became more of a conservative party. Roosevelt's third-party run was a sort of progressive exodus from the Republican Party, and many moved to the Democrats after.
The thing about third parties, the two parties don't really stand for anything, which makes them very good at co-opting dissent, at absorbing dissent, at absorbing third parties. It's very hard for third parties to get started or to last in American history. And typically, the great American historian Richard Hofstadter said, third parties are like bumblebees. They sting once and then they die. Put another way, very often in American history, third parties serve simply as a way station or a stopping point for one group of people on their way out of one of the two big parties towards the other.
The movie also discusses Woodrow Wilson, who was quite the controversial dude. He was an interventionist, he resegregated the White House, and yeah, he was a Democrat. He's also one of the most influential presidents on the modern neoconservative movement, which Dinesh supports. Wilson's influence on presidents like George W. Bush and his infamous catchphrase, "making the world safe for democracy," have been cited as justification for America's involvements in war after war by both parties. In fact, it's one of the most common justifications for war, possibly only behind fighting communism and wanting the enemy's stuff. I can't end this section though without showing this amazing and baffling scene where, while screening Birth of a Nation at the White House, the original one, not the decidedly less racist 2016 film of the same name, a Klansman on horseback rides off the screen and onto the lawn with a stunned Wilson following. This is the only supernatural scene in the whole movie, and I spent way too much time trying to understand why they blew the money on it. The progressive influx after Teddy Roosevelt's third-party run pushed the Democratic Party in a new direction. These new voters influenced policy, and for a while, the party was a strange hybrid of causes. There was a fairly progressive northern contingent representing the working classes, teamed up with a southern white supremacist traditionalist contingent. Meanwhile, the demographics of America were also shifting. African Americans left the South in droves, building new communities and urban centers in the North in a period known as the Great Migration. In the 1930s, Franklin Roosevelt undertook the New Deal, a massive increase in the size of the federal government to directly intervene and resuscitate the collapsed Great Depression economy. Boy, given the state of our economy, it sure would be nice if we could have a New Deal today. Don't you think? Maybe a green one? The class politics of the New Deal have made division between the Democratic Party's two factions even weirder. Through the 30s, more and more Northern African Americans became Democratic Party voters as part of the New Deal coalition, which elected Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR, more times than any other president. Though I should mention the New Deal actually did very little for black people, unfortunately. This coalition led to a period of strong but unsteady Democratic control over the country. Any move against segregation threatened the balance of the party's northern and southern factions, as well as the tenuous peace between the party's chill guy and coalition. So, this period had Democratic presidents with complicated legacies on race because, as it turns out, presidents are politicians first and foremost. Nonetheless, it does show that the party shifted as the North became more populous. After FDR's death, we had the first of the major breaks from the Southern Democrats, which Dinesh's movie denies happened despite, all the evidence. FDR's successor Harry Truman desegregated the military in 1948 and sparked a flashpoint in the party. Many white supremacist Southern Democrats were livid over this move and made a new Dixiecrat faction, which even encouraged people against voting for Truman in the 1948 election. In the 1950s and 1960s, the politics of the rights of African Americans shifted in the explosion of what historians call the short civil rights movement. This was a huge upheaval as African Americans made the strong case to end segregation and advocate for their rights. It's a massive historical moment which could not only be its own video, but its own channel or several channels. The rising tide of the civil rights movement was an opportunity for the Democrats, then led by Lyndon B. Johnson. He was a Southerner and came from the Democratic tradition of trying to appease the two wings of the party, but he also idolized FDR and wanted to rival, if not best him. So, Johnson, in the wake of his predecessor John F. Kennedy's assassination, passed the Civil Rights Act, one of the most important pieces of legislation in American history. As he signed it, he pointed out that with this law, they were, quote, giving the South to the Democrats for a generation, which was pretty astute. However, it's been more than a generation since then. That same year, the Republican Party was shifting too. They ran Barry Goldwater, a much more far-right candidate than the Republicans had ever pushed before. He was considered such a massive leap to the right, the Republicans lost the election rather handily. Though Goldwater did carry a few states, ones the Republicans hadn't won in a long time. On top of Goldwater's home state of Arizona, the Republicans took Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, and South Carolina. The angry Southern white man was leaving the Democratic Party, just as Johnson imagined. 4 years later, the Democrats had a myriad of problems. The Vietnam War had made Johnson so unpopular he decided not to seek re-election. But most importantly to the story, someone else ran. Though Dinesh didn't care much to mention this, Dixiecrat George Wallace ran a third-party campaign as a pro-segregation candidate. Remember what Dr. MacDougall said about third-party candidates? The election was a massive victory for the Republicans, and Richard Nixon and George Wallace carried 5 southern states. Following this election, except for the 1976 election of Jimmy Carter, the South would be a solid Republican stronghold, and it has been ever since. How did that happen? What were the Republicans up to? Richard Nixon and Republican strategists saw a crack in what was called the Solid South. And with the help of Dixiecrats who crossed the aisle, like Strom Thurmond, they strategized to move the South into the Republican Party. However, being openly racist wasn't popular anymore. People wouldn't vote for open segregationists spouting racial slurs. So the party turned to coded languages and dog whistles, language that's not explicitly racist, but people who share that ideology get the message, with others being none the wiser. These are terms like law and order or states' rights. Watch this video on the death of a metaphor to learn more. Using this coded language was a Republican masterstroke of the late 20th century, and it carried them to many electoral victories until recently, when all of a sudden, it seems they don't actually need coded language anymore. So, the strategy appeared to be working. The early 70s saw a period of backlash by white suburban society. Frustration over the lack of racial progress pushed the civil rights movement to become more insistent and radical, scaring suburban white voters. These people were also anxious about the free love and drugs of the youth counterculture. They were afraid of many things and didn't like that the world was moving on without them. Watch a few episodes of All in the Family to understand this kind of person. With this, the Republicans decided they didn't need the black vote anymore. Which is odd, as you can see here. Republican politicians were pretty supportive of the Civil Rights Act not long ago. So this was a pretty big shift from 1964 to 1968. Without George Wallace, and despite being the last, quote, liberal Republican, Nixon used dog whistle language and his campaigning to conservative backlash, and both of those plans paid off. In 1972, Nixon used the dog whistle language and his campaigning to conservative backlash, and it paid off huge. In 1972, Nixon managed to convince moderates he was moderate and used just enough language to convince white supremacists he was on their side. He won in a landslide with 61% of the national vote, but more than 70% in the Deep South. Oh, and only about 18% of the African American vote. A long way from the party of Lincoln and Grant. The true master of the dog whistle, though, was Ronald Reagan. His manicured image and right language led to massive victories in the 80s. He used other wedge issues between the more conservative traditionalist South and a perceived liberal elite. Abortion, gay rights, immigration have all been part of a evolving Southern strategy. Many of these issues weren't even large and politically charged issues until the intentional intervention to use these as wedges to push a partisan agenda. The losses brought about by this new tactic devastated the Democrats. So many traditionally Democratic voters backed Reagan that they got the nickname Reagan Democrats. And the Democrats have been trying to build a new stable coalition ever since. They got a few lucky breaks, like Ross Perot's campaigning in the 90s, which split the conservative vote, but by and large, the Democrats have been in decline. To win back the Reagan Democrats, the party tried to move right on issues to deal with redistributive economics, like President Bill Clinton deregulating the economy and cutting social services. He also tried to play the dog whistle game with welfare reform and tough-on-crime legislation. This is more evidence against Dinesh's movie. The Democratic and Republican parties are organizations constantly shifting to build new winning coalitions. We've even seen this in the last few years as the Democratic Party establishment rejected the rising socialist movement in America. Many cheerleaders of Bush Jr.'s neoconservative wars of conquest are now major Democratic influencers, with both parties flanking further and further right, and the Republicans flirting with open white nationalism. It's not a good place to be. And speaking of racism, I think Dr. MacDougall has an important take Dinesh ought to listen to.
Lots of people think that they have discovered something when they learn that there were racist Republicans, in the Civil War years, or that Lincoln, was not progressive by our standards on questions of race, or that the Republican Party did not begin 100% committed to abolition. All those things are true. They don't actually represent, again, to me, gotchas more than they are sort of recognition of the the contested, complicated nature of politics and history and racial progress in America. I enjoy sort of, pulling out all the threads and following the threads and trying to reconstruct the story. But again, there's a whole problem with the framing if you think, A, like I said, what the parties are is not nailed down, but B, like why does D'Souza or anyone else assume that there's one good party and one bad party, or one racist party and one not racist party? Like that's not in the Constitution. That's not a rule. If you discover that one party is racist or supports racist policies, it doesn't mean the other party isn't. There have been, certainly both parties have enacted racist policies and done racist things in American history. And yet one can imagine, like I could hope for a world in which neither of the two parties supported white supremacy. I don't know why it is that we have to there has to be one or the other.
Edit and final encode, which only takes 10 seconds. All right, yeah, it's done. Let's see how this puppy does. Let's put it on the internet.
2 hours later.
6 views? 6 views? How could this go so wrong?
Well, Tristan...
What? It's Mia Mulder. Were we on a voice call this whole time?
You can have the best ideas, or reasonably good ideas, or maybe less than terrible ideas, but even the best argument isn't going to convince anyone instantly. It's confirmation bias. People tend to hold the beliefs that affirm their own worldview, whether it makes sense or not. Owning a, let's be fair, mid-tier right-wing provocateur isn't enough to defend how we remember anything.
Holy crap. You're right. It's like I've made no difference at all. Oh, that's good whiskey. Hello, my name is Bernard Cronshaw. You may know me as the second Nubbleberry and as the 69th Doctor Who. I am also the actor who plays Tristan on the hot sitcom Step Back History. Normally, we have lots of laughs and great hijinks on the Nibblehop. That's what we call YouTube here in England. But I am here to tell you about something a little more serious than our typical light-hearted frivolity. Like many of you, I suffer from a debilitating condition known as skill deficiency. Too often, I have needed to do something requiring illustration, design, photography, video, or freelancing. And without skills, I'm forced to hire many, many assistants with all of my George Soros money. What is 6-time BAFTA winner Bernard Cronshaw to do? Well, today, I'm going to share with you the secret to how I became much more employable and put so many, many assistants completely out of work for the crime of not being 6-time BAFTA winner Bernard Cronshaw. I take Skillshare. Skillshare is a learning community supplement. When I am feeling skill deficient, I simply take 2 doses of Skillshare, and I can literally do anything. It comes in thousands of varieties, or courses, as the copy here says. I am personally taking a regimen known as Python 3, Programming in Python for Beginners by Arkadiusz Vorderschlag, to learn how to make my computer go beep boop in ways which please me. You might be thinking, hey, 6-time BAFTA winner Bernard Cronshaw, you're a multi-millionaire and world-renowned Shakespearean actor. Of course, you can afford Skillshare, while I am but a lowly peasant. Well, lowly peasant, Skillshare is actually surprisingly affordable. And if you look in the description, you can get a code for a free 2-month supply. So please ask your doctor if Skillshare is right for you. It's a website.
I mean, if you want to change things...
I have to take my argument to the source. The only way to stop Dinesh D'Souza is to take my arguments to Dinesh D'Souza.
No, Tristan, no, that's not gonna...
Thanks so much, Mia. He needs to be stopped.
Finally! With the stones together, I can change it all. History will finally agree. Liberals won't be able to change my marginal tax bracket now.
All right, Tristan, this is it. I can only convince this monstrous villain he's wrong if I'm the best teacher on Earth. Dinesh, It's me, Tristan, from the email. Dinesh, there's no need for such destruction. There's no shame in being wrong as long as you're open to learning. Hell, I'm wrong all the time. What you're doing with these documentaries perverts history to suit a political agenda. It's dangerous. It feeds a partisan narrative, painting Republicans as heroes and Democrats as irredeemable villains. Not only is that a path to perilous thinking, but it also denies the truth. Both parties are just awful.
Wait, I'm here with an apocalyptic weapon, and you come and correct my history? You don't think I know my documentaries are full of shit? I don't need to be right when I can be powerful. I simply have to make history politically correct.
Wait, you don't care about education at all?
Propaganda doesn't care about what's right. You thought you could convince people by appealing to their minds, but you should have gone for the gut.
Mr. History, I don't feel so good.
The Byzantine Empire never actually called themselves that. They only saw themselves for what they were, the Roman Empire. For maybe a quarter, I can explain the horrible impacts of the Justinian plague. It'll explain why you're a little too close to me right now for social distancing. Sir? Sir? He'll be back. That story is irresistible.